recorded at Get a Grip Studios in Toronto, Canada, a Get a Grip management production and in association with the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. Financially supported by the good folks at the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, this is Restoring Darkness podcast.
This episode of Restoring Darkness is brought to you by Evluma. If you're serious about contributing to the reduction of light pollution, go to evluma.com, hover over products, and click on Dark Sky Friendly Lighting. Both the OmniMax and AreaMax lights are International Dark Sky Association certified. The warmer color temperatures of the OmniMax reduce the more easily scattered blue wavelengths, which contribute to glare and sky glow. With AreaMax lights, you get full cutoff, which also means no uplight and a significantly reduced contribution to sky glow. And all of Evluma's outdoor lighting product lines come with dimmable drivers for even more control. If your customer is looking for dark sky-friendly fixtures with energy savings while still meeting the demands of decorative lighting, look no further than Evluma. Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of dark skies.
Welcome back to the Restoring Darkness podcast. On today's show, I have Mark Major. Mark trained and practiced as an architect prior to focusing on the unique relationship between light and architecture. He was honored as a Royal Designer for Industry in 2012 and served as Master of the Faculty of Royal Designers for Industry from 2020 until 2022. Mark formed Speirs Major with Keith Bradshaw, which grew out of Speirs and Major Associates. Speirs Major are recognized as being one of the world's largest lighting design practices, using light and darkness to enhance the experience of the visual environment. He has led a wide range of award-winning lighting projects, including the Millennium Dome, 30 St. Mary Acts, Beijing International Airport, the refurbishment of Royal Festival Hall, and the relighting of the interior of St. Paul's Cathedral. I've never heard of any of those places. Recent award-winning projects include Gasholders London, the Macallan Distillery, and Norwich Cathedral. He's a specialist in the field of urban lighting and was named as a key city advisor by Monocle in 2013. Mark acted as the lighting design advisor to the Olympic Delivery Authority for London in 2012 and was appointed to the Mayor of London's Special Assistance Team for the Outer London Fund in the same year. With an active interest in architectural and lighting education, Mark has lectured extensively in the UK, Europe, Scandinavia, US, and Australia. He was the co-creator of an educational project, Made of Light, the Art of Light and Architecture. Mark is also a corporate member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, a fellow of the International Association of Lighting Designers, and a fellow of the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland. Mark Major, it is my honor to have you on the show.
Thanks, Michael. Delighted to be here.
Before we, I always love to talk to lighting practitioners the most. Particularly people that are sort of steeped in the idea of lighting and darkness as both having value. Tell me a little bit about when and how darkness became a part of your lighting design practice and why it is valuable to your customers.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I think for me personally, and I guess it plays out through the work of the practice over time, it's always been with me. I really, if I'm honest, always wanted to be a painter, but I ended up an architect, and then to me, actually, going into lighting design was a little bit like sort of, I'm not saying getting back to painting, but it's sort of creatively, it sort of offered different opportunities. And I've always understood, as a painter, that we're sort of subtracting light as we add paint to a white canvas. And when I got into lighting, I always understood it was sort of almost like the inverse, if you see what I mean, light being an additive medium. So to me, it seemed very logical that darkness was, as the sort of counterpart to light, was something that, you couldn't talk about light without talking about its counterpart. And actually, it's not just about darkness, it's also about shadow and shadow play and degrees of darkness and degrees of light, if you see what I mean. So to me, it's intrinsic. I think sometimes lighting designers or the lighting design community get a bit lazy just talking about the additive as opposed to the subtractive. But I guess for me, that's always been important. And I started writing about and talking about the value of darkness quite early on in our practice. And the more I got involved in urban design work and urban lighting, producing master plans and lighting strategies for cities, particularly here in the UK, historic cities such as Cambridge and Durham. These are cities that I found to be very dark. And when I talked to people, I discovered that even though, of course, they were worried about safety, security, all the stuff that we're all worried about, when
Hmm.
we walk through a
Of
city,
course.
I also got a lot of feedback at the time, particularly in Cambridge, that actually people valued the darkness of the city. They kind of liked the privacy that it brought, the
Mm.
sort of atmosphere that they
Hmm.
did. They generally felt pretty safe. But the thing they were most worried about was overlighting. That we would come in and we would sort of spoil the city by adding too much light.
You can sure do that, and it gets really easy with LEDs because of the capacity. I always say, like, the easiest. People talk about energy efficiency. I think the Jevons paradox is that we fall into with light is often driven by circuit capacity. Like, it's not just that we save energy, but it's also that you can put so many, and I don't, pretend to know the electrical infrastructure of the UK or Europe, but here in Canada, you can put an awful lot of very bright LED lights on one 15 amp circuit. And
Yeah.
so when they're saying, when you say to an electrician, say, I want to light this parking lot up, well, we can throw a bullhorn on the top of that pole and put 3 or 4 LED 80-watt LED lights to replace that one 400-watt metal halide or HPS or whatever was there. And so there is a lot of factors that play into the default setting, which is to overlight everything, which is to blast it with as much as possible, like a prison yard.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of the background to that is that, not surprisingly, it was the lighting industry itself that preached the message, particularly in the early part of its evolution, the beginning of the 20th century,
Of course.
uh, that brightest is best. That's
Hmm.
where that message came from. It came from the people that were selling the lights.
Yeah. Well,
And
also, I mean, the Eiffel Tower was built to light the entire city of Paris all night
yeah,
long. I mean, you think
precisely.
about the
Yeah.
mindset, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Um,
But I grant you that, in a sense, artificial light in particular has always had a lot to do symbolically with the sort of idea of progress, the idea of things moving
mhm,
forward, the future. So I could see symbolically at that time that actually sort of the brighter you can make it, the better people perceived it to be. And, that's coming from we're coming at the moment from the position of privilege in the developed world of being able to talk about overlighting. Light poverty is something that exists in other parts of the world where
sure
actually
does.
people don't have street lighting. And I'm sure
Hmm.
in Ukraine at the moment, where unfortunately they've pretty much lost their entire power grid.
Mm,
It's going to be a grim winter. No one's going to be worrying about overlighting in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they're going
mm.
to be they're not going to have any light at all. So we are talking from a position of privilege, of talking about issues such as overlighting and light pollution.
Hmm.
Nonetheless, it's an important topic.
I think a privilege is one way to look at it. I think another way to look at it is stability. I think
Yeah,
that we were fortunate enough to have live in places where there isn't war, or famine, or with stable electricity grids and these types of things that largely is taken for granted. But I give you that there is something about this issue which can seem ridiculous to those that lack basic lighting for their lives. But the perception of lighting as being the indicator of success or societal advancement is still with us. I mean, I just saw the other day on Twitter. I've said this a couple times, listeners. I know we get complaints about me repeating myself from time to time. But what it was an image of North Korea and South Korea, and it was saying that capitalism is better than communism because look at the light pollution. Right? That was the image, right? There's no lights in North Korea, and South Korea is a complete fire of electric light at night.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so that perception, I think, is still largely with us. That electric light is somehow this undercurrent of success or development or being ahead, and the more the better. And so I think that's where we need to chip away at that perception, that idea.
Yeah. Well, I think it's understandable because, in a sense, without electric light, there's an awful lot that we wouldn't be able to do economically or socially.
Hmm.
And there's I think there's one or two people that have spoken about that in the past. Historians and people that for instance, the great architectural historian Rainer Banham wrote a fantastic essay many years ago called Edison, the Missing Pioneer. And it was all about the idea that Edison, architects in particular celebrate lots of things like, the development of steel and concrete and lifts and
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of things. But rarely does, electric light get a look in terms of the way it allowed not only buildings to advance, but the society that those buildings supported to advance in terms of means of production, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of, being able to work, be able to shop,
Productivity.
to play, to do all of that stuff. And that all
Mm-hmm.
counts towards our economy. And, that makes us wealthier as nations. And so, I can see this sort of where that sort of positive outlook on electric light can come from and why it still exists.
I think it's the greatest invention next to indoor plumbing that we also take for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. Sanitation is a
Yeah,
big
I
issue.
mean, like, people don't think about it. I think the cover of The Economist had a toilet on it a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
when they were talking about, the most impactful innovations of all time. Although they failed to mention electric light in the article, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I mean, we overlook we take it for granted, and I suppose that we've been giving the devil his due, with when talking about this, but I think we uniquely find ourselves in a quandary in 2022 and moving forward, in that we have to reassess this idea that more light equals more safety, and I think it needs to start with people like you, Mark, in the architectural trade, with that. Bring back the beauty, bring back the artistic feel to our cities. Not no light, but I think the IDA calls it responsible outdoor light at night is a good term.
Listen,
How do you do it?
yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we have practiced and preached for, well, years now, the idea that less, if there's ever an area of design where less is more, it's in lighting design.
Mm.
I know it's a very sort of hackneyed phrase and it comes out of architecture, but nonetheless, it's very true when it comes down to our discipline, because what one of the problems that people don't seem to sort of relate to is that quite often the problems that they experience at night in the cities is to do with contrast.
Mm-hmm.
Extremes of contrast. And we've worked in cities where we pointed out that just by making this street brighter, you've
Mm-hmm.
simply made all the adjacencies darker and more threatening.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just, it's about the quality of the lit environment, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of, and particularly the aesthetic quality of the lit environment that isn't so important. It's not just how we see, but it's how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of our work is as much to do with perception as it is to do with vision. And what we know is that of course, we have to have enough light to see, but the human eye, the healthy human eye, is pretty amazing. You can see in sort of less than 1 lux in sort of moonlight. You
Mm-hmm.
can see in 100,000 lux in bright sunlight. So, as a scale, that's pretty impressive. I know, our eyes take time to adapt and we have to take that into account. But the healthy human eye, or even the relatively healthy human eye, can deal in pretty low levels of illumination quite comfortably as long as it's adapted. And so, to me, lux levels are relative.
Mm.
I think people have a, sort of will sit down and say, well, we need this much light here, we need this. And I often say, why? If this much light is okay here, why isn't it okay over there? And we sort of see crazy amounts of light used, in the streets, almost amounts of light that you would have indoors as opposed to outdoors. And that's a huge question. So for me, it's about, I think our role as lighting designers is to sort of challenge some of the conventions that have grown up over time and the standards that have been, I think, dictated by a mix of different people who perhaps have different agendas.
Interesting. There, I often mention prison yards, and you talked about the idea of contrast, which I actually wrote down before you said it when you were talking about earlier in the conversation. I wanted to bring up contrast and how contrast is used. I was in an art gallery the other day, and I pointed out the problem with their lighting system was that there was no contrast between the artwork on the wall and the wall. You need to have more light here and less light here. And so I was pointing this out to them. But when you think about how a prison yard actually works, or how a police officer, say, when he walks up to you in your car at night and shines a flashlight in your eyes. What he's doing, or what that person is doing, or that prison is doing, is creating an extreme difference between the two people involved with the light. One person can see the other, and the other can't see the other person. And so there's a power dynamic. There's a prison of the panopticon created where they don't know if they're being watched or who's looking at them or what they have, and so on. There's a power dynamic created there. And I think when we do this on our highways, and that, I think even though there may be more measurements on the lux meter, or these other crude measurements we use to design lighting, I think we lose we're not taking into account that contrast effect where somebody outside the party at your house at night can see everything in your window, but you can't see them watching you in their window. And so there's like this difference between those two effects, and we create that with LEDs, I think, much easier than we did with metal halide and HPS. We create those situations where there's an extreme contrast, and we interviewed a fellow years ago who talked about the problems with this at crosswalks, that this massive difference in light is actually causing less visual acuity at crosswalks than it is creating visual acuity. And so how do we get out of this mess, Mark? Like, what is it that we have to do as lighting designers, distributors, as an industry? How do we get out of it?
I just think it's a question of constant reevaluation of this. As again, I come back to the standards that we're often required to work to, and being brave enough or strong enough to sort of challenge some of those standards. I mean, we're quite well known in our profession for being innovative, but I'd like to think that part of that innovation isn't to do with technology, just with technology. It's also being innovative in terms of the way in which we sort of examine just the basic premise of what we do. And for many years, particularly when we're working on urban lighting schemes, we've gone in and had some pretty tough conversations with local government about saying, well, why don't we try and actually reduce the amount of light across your city by 10%, 20%? We're not necessarily challenging the uniformity values. But what we are saying is, given that the quality of light is so much better, a lot of these standards were set up when HPS or even low pressure sodium was around.
Sodium, sure.
And they've barely changed, and yet we've got broader spectrum light, tons of light in the blue end of the spectrum. Totally new light sources that enable people to, with amazing. I mean, almost from I guess I'm showing my age here, but almost too much good, too good a color rendering. You can almost see a bit too well.
Exactly. Yeah, it might be true.
I still have a romantic, have a sort of slightly romantic notion of, of low pressure sodium sort of having this sort of interesting, edgy sort of nighttime quality, but that's a whole different topic. But nonetheless, we can see so well in LED light. So incredibly well. Why are the standards these days in terms of the amount of light you deliver pretty similar now to what they were 25, 30 years ago? It's hardly changed at all.
Yeah, it's true. And it's interesting. I think my small town where I live actually is lit with HPS lights that are kind of torch lights, and I'm involved in trying to tell them not to. They've begun switching them to 5,000 Kelvin LEDs, and it just looks awful. Like the fixture looks awful, and you're losing the feeling of the street, and that's a solvable problem. But before we get to I have another question for you that I want to ask. But before we get there, I think this movement has missed on the regulation piece, which is what you were kind of referring to, or standards.
Yep.
If you've ever been involved in a serious lawsuit involving roadway and lighting and all this sort of stuff, you find that the first thing the lawyers pull out is those regulations and standards.
Precisely.
And if somebody has, if the lighting has failed to meet the standard, or somebody decided to go dark sky at this, highway on-ramp or whatever, you're going to see massive lawsuits which are going to backfire against this movement big time. So I think we need to address that regulation piece. And as individual jurisdictions, because I know it's an Ontario law. Okay, so we have this balkanization of this. So it's just my province has their traffic and roadway standards for crosswalks and lighting and all this kind of stuff. And Quebec has a different standard, and maybe Minnesota and England and different parts of Europe. But I think we need to really start putting together a regulatory advisory council or something for people to guide people in how to make these changes correctly, because we do need lighting, right? But we also want to make sure that we're being responsible from like responsible outdoor light at night. I like that kind of acronym. Roll on. Are we putting the cart in front of the horse? Should we go back and start addressing these regulations and contacting governments? And
Well, yes, I unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because one of the things I liked about lighting design when I first came into it, over 30 years ago, was unlike architecture, which I was studying in, it seemed to have less rules. It was less rule bound, and
yeah, it's
I'm
for
not saying
sure.
I'm I'm a maverick and a great rule breaker, but I like the fact that in a sense it had a sort of creative freedom. If you see what I mean, there weren't a lot of predetermined tenets against which you design, and then certainly in the early days of lighting, we really didn't. I probably shouldn't confess this on a show, but we really didn't sort of get driven by lighting standards at all. We just kind of did what we felt, and quite often that sort of people liked what we did, and felt that was correct. It wasn't a question of going around with light meters measuring everything. It was just it just sort of worked, and based on sort of a combination of intuition and experience. And I think actually, certainly in our practice and in UK practice, I've seen actually a greater adherence and concern to be sort of compliant with numbers the whole time. It's even impacted us, as I say, in our practice, despite our heritage and not coming from that base, coming from a more artistic and creative base. And I think that, as you rightly say, that is to do with a sort of fear of risk that has come into society, which is just getting worse and worse. Somebody always wants a number to judge somebody by. So what happens in lighting is it all gets converted into sort of measurements of light.
Yes.
Whereas
I would say it
how do you
degenerates to that. It
yeah,
degenerates to that.
degenerates. Yeah, you're
Yes.
absolutely right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often have this sort of argument about sort of saying, when I'm talking about urban lighting, about talking about something being well lit, and I always qualify that by saying, but I don't mean brightly lit. Because quite often, you'll say well lit to a member of the public, and they're immediately in their mind, they'll think, oh, you mean brightly lit. It's like, no, I don't mean that. In fact, I mean the opposite. I often mean, that there's less light, but maybe there's more light on vertical surfaces. Maybe there's, there's a little bit more texture or color, or you can, the environment is more intelligible, more legible.
Or it turns itself off at 11 p.m.
Or it turns itself off at 11 p.m. Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, when I drive home, where I live, there's a lot of sort of people that have moved to the country, so to speak, and they have lit up all the trees on their front lawn, and like 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll see. I go to work really early sometimes. You'll see there's these lights on trees and all this kind of stuff, and you just think to yourself, it's very ostentatious. To do that, let alone, I don't know, the environmental consequences for the bugs. And I mean, we can think about all those things, but
absolutely.
I mean, well lit I think also means well controlled, especially for outdoor lighting.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. And I didn't quite finish answering your question.
Oh, sorry.
On the regulatory thing. So I digressed. I do think, unfortunately, as I say, that we have to sort of begin to regulate things more in order to sort of introduce a greater sense of responsibility and control, for all the reasons that you and I, I'm sure, share in terms of sort of reducing light pollution, saving energy, reduction of waste, impacts on people and ecology. We all know the reasons that we want to control light better and sort of be more responsible. And I think that there will have to be regulatory frameworks, but my only concern is who it is that writes those regulations.
Yes.
Are they going to be people that really, really have enough experience and enough understanding of the subtleties of light and lighting design, particularly in the outdoor environment? Or are they going to be sort of bureaucrats, or should I say, lobbied bureaucrats,
Yes.
that will make decisions in the wrong direction? Because the lighting industry, like every industry, and I'm probably sounding overly critical, is not shy of lobbying.
Well, I mean, these words we say, like regulation, like depending on the conversation you're in, you could have someone welcome that and say we need more regulation, and how dare anyone say regulation is bad, and then on the other side say we need to get rid of all regulations. like there's too much of a Manichaean worldview with words, where
Yeah.
they trigger people to have a reaction. And there's so many, of these words where it's like there's a huge nuanced discussion flowing from them. And when we're talking about critical infrastructure, so we're talking about critical infrastructure, outdoor street lighting. We're talking about, safety. We're talking about environmental responsibility, energy efficiency. These things are very important conversations. And so we need to be able to talk about regulations, how they're written, who writes them, who do these people know what the hell they're talking about, And so what I wanted to ask you, and I wrote this note earlier on, and I wanted to get through the regulation piece a little bit because I think it's very key. Um, do we know how to do this, Mark? Like right now, I think we have the technology, right? So I think we have the control systems. We know the lower Kelvin temperatures. We can shield lighting. We can dim lighting. We can do all these wonderful things, and we can make all these amazing light fixtures, which will preserve our night skies and keep our streets safe and do all this stuff. But do we know how to write these regulations? Do we know as an industry and as architects and designers and all that? Can we get together? And do we know what to do? And can we do it? That's the follow up question to that, Mark.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I mean, we recently, I can't talk in too much detail about it because it's still sort of a live project. But we recently have been asked by a local government in the UK to help them develop a set of standards for the control of light within their urban area. To try and sort of reduce light spill from office buildings, to sort of
Hmm.
put limits in terms of sort of private lighting and sort of the unregulated and uncontrolled level of private lighting that sometimes can be a blight, and signage and advertising and all of those
Mm-hmm.
issues. So, it's a very progressive study. And I know from our experience of working on that, when we get down to the nitty gritty in terms of talking to those people that are sort of, we're working with who are in local government, they're saying, well, we get the fact that you guys can write guidance, very responsible guidance that you hope everybody will follow, but we have to enforce this guidance. If you see what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we have to sort of
Mm-hmm.
make sure that people follow it. And
Mm-hmm.
what happens? It's great if everybody sort of follows the guidance and in a very democratic way. But what if we get a bad apple that decides, well, to hell with the guidance, I'm going to do this? How
Mm-hmm.
do we then enforce or regulate that? And that's a really tricky question because
Mm-hmm.
it then raises the issue of we're back to numbers
Exactly.
because they want something to measure. And it's sort of so it's a very live issue you're mentioning in terms of but I think that, as to how to do this, and I wish I had a sort of unique answer to it, but so in that particular case, what we've been doing is trying to sort of um, consult on and gradually develop a simple set of guidelines, but with as limited a numerical framework as we can to try and make it easy to sort of hit the big issues, such as as I say, monumental light spill from buildings, or the visual brightness of major signage or whatever. But otherwise, rely on people sort of following guidance as being sort of best practice, and sort of trying to sort of encourage people to do the right thing. So I think you're right that regulation is a very difficult word, and I would love to feel that we could just write guidance and everybody would follow it, a little bit like dark skies, the dark skies people come up with ordinance, and that ordinance
Mm-hmm.
is
Model
not
lighting ordinance, yeah.
it's not law,
Mm-hmm.
but nonetheless it's sort of implied that if you want to be a dark skies community, you kind of need to follow this.
Mm-hmm.
And that strikes me as a sort of a very positive way forward, as opposed to being a legal framework. But as soon as you're dealing with issues such as safety, particularly road traffic and accidents and
Mm-hmm.
things like that, then unfortunately we live in a society where people want sort of what they see as sort of hard and fast rules that they can say yes, this complies, and no, it doesn't. And it's tricky stuff because light is such a tricky medium to talk about and sort of for people to understand. So I don't have an immediate answer to that. I think what I do have an answer is that it's people like us, and I'm not saying just us, we at Speirs Major or whatever, but I think experienced lighting designers who've worked in the urban environment for many years definitely are the right people for government to talk to, whether it's local government or central government to talk to, in order to ask advice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I sometimes see things a lot said about lighting by all sorts of people, And I think, well, what's your frame of reference? Where's your experience?
Mhm.
I think sometimes, a lot of people think the lighting's terribly easy. Um,
I
and,
think it's both. I think it's both. I mean, from the distributor end of it. So when I leave here, I go out and sell people light bulbs and light fixtures, and we do projects. And I actually do a lot of churches, not St. Paul's Cathedral, certainly. I mean, but we do lots of sanctuaries and
yeah,
these kinds of things. We help people with their lighting problems. So I think it's both easy. It's one of those things that gets you into the Copernican versus Democritean dilemma. You go from the tiniest thing in the world to the universe. They're both and everything in between. Uh, but one of the things that our trade association, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, that presents this show, we came up with 6 strategies for darkness restoration and preservation, and the first one was industry alignment. And when the committee came out with that, and they're like, most people in the lighting industry are not interested in darkness preservation at all. They're not interested in it at all.
no,
They have no stake in that game. They see it as a threat. In fact, it's actually a negative conversation because people think you're going to sell less lights, and we're trying to convince them that listen, if we all get on board with this, we just put almost every light fixture that's outside back into the play here. It's available to be changed again and improved, and it's a good value thing. How do we? So the regulatory piece is going to come from hopefully industry practitioners like yourself and others, maybe through industry groups like Society of Light and Lighting or IES or these different organizations. But how do we get the industry to align to this issue? It's very difficult. There's a lot of resistance.
yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. I think it's a matter of trust. And you're completely correct. I don't think it's just to do with the fact that it's sort of about the opportunity to sell everything all over again. I think that sort of is something that the lighting industry has been very good at over the years of sort of inventing new technologies and sort of you know building in redundancy in a sense into both technology and approaches. So it guarantees a replacement further down the line. Um, I also think it's about quite often a lot of lighting that we're involved in tends to deal with a larger number of smaller things as opposed to a small number of large things. You made the analogy of the prison yard at the beginning of this conversation.
Hmm.
It's about one big floodlight, producing as massive amount of light from one position as you can,
Hmm.
often in the name of efficiency. And whereas actually quite often good lighting design involves, and it's something that our clients observe, there seem to be an awful lot of lights. And what we say is, yeah, but they're a lot more controlled. You can light a room, you can light your living area with one lamp in the middle of the ceiling,
Hmm.
but it doesn't feel very good, and it
Hmm.
probably isn't very adequate. Equally, you can go out and buy half a dozen table lamps and light your room in that way.
Hmm.
You've now got half a dozen things as opposed to one thing in the middle of the room, but it's better,
Hmm.
or it should be better as a result. And I think the opportunity for the lighting industry and distributors is very much in terms of the larger number of smaller things, as much as it is in sort of replacing what's already there. Because it's for definite. If let's say you want to light a path
Hmm.
through a sensitive area, and we have to light it to a certain level, to a certain degree of uniformity, then the result you're going to end up with is low level path lights, or maybe even bollards, if you see what I mean, something
Hmm.
below eye
Sure.
level that's sort of
Yep.
more controlled, where
Hmm.
you're going to end up with 5, 6, 7 times more of those than you are if you have something on a column at regular, wide regular spacings. um, and that's just, to me, good lighting often involves a sort of a finer level, a finer grain of detail, and a finer grain of delivery. So but I don't think at the end of the day how how lighting gets sold is necessarily should be the center of the conversation. I think it's to do with a sort of partnership, an ongoing partnership, which has been there for decades between those that design with light and
Hmm.
those that manufacture and supply light.
Hmm.
Traditionally, there's always been a little bit of division between those groups, and I think it started certainly in my day when I started into lighting design. That division existed because manufacturers provided free lighting design services in order, from our perception, to sell as many light fittings as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the reason that clients decided to pay people like us fees to design lighting was that they would get an independent view that was not sort of just coming from one manufacturer who wanted to, sell as many lights as possible and get people to buy as many boxes from them as they could. But we would take an independent view on what was the best way to illuminate a space. Now, to me, that didn't necessarily lead to less light fixtures, delivering the solution, but it would lead to sort of maybe a different attitudes in terms of um, developing the brief, beginning to state ways in which to sort of do things, and sort of talking about sort of aesthetics and an approach in an entirely different way. And besides, free lunches often aren't always, what they're cracked up to be. So, quite often, if you get a free service, there's always a catch. There's no such thing as a free lunch, really. So I think, so when I say working in partnership, what I mean is I think that we can help, lighting designers like us can help, signal the way to, to future trends, and sort of help manufacturers see the way, the direction of travel that lighting is going to go in. Similarly, I think we need to increasingly use products that, are delivered as a result of circular design, can be fully recycled and upgraded, if necessary, elements composted, or if they have to be wasted, then wasted in a responsible way. And we've seen, certainly just in the last year or two here in the UK and Europe, as regulation around circularity and around sort of the responsible disposal of lighting technologies has begun to sort of, take center stage. This is a big issue for us here in the UK, and it is in the rest of the world, but, it's a sort of very live moment. SLL and CIBSE, the organization they're part of, have introduced new guidance and standards around this topic very recently, and we're all sort of educating ourselves. And what we found is that that's led us into really interesting conversations with manufacturers about how they're going to deliver that. Because it's all very well, talking about circularity and talking about sort of all of these issues, but the people that make the light fittings and distribute and sell the light fittings have to be compliant. And there's a rapid change taking place in the industry, of move towards compliance around issues of disposal and recycling, and sort of the embodied energy that goes into fixtures. We all want to know a lot more about this stuff. And we found that that's led us into really interesting and very positive conversations with manufacturers about how we can help them, but also how they can help us deliver more responsible schemes. So I think it's just a change of perception, it's a change of language, it's a change of attitude, and it's just sort of thinking about the future in a different way.
So it's interesting. I actually own a company called Waste Diversion, and so we recycle millions of fluorescent tubes and mercury-containing lamps, and also light fixtures and all this kind of stuff. And I find that these conversations are absent the kind of expertise that I have. So when people talk about reusing light fittings, a lot of times when I listen to them, I know that they've never removed a fixture from a ceiling in their entire career, or let alone 1281 or whatever it is, right? And so I see when they talk about circularity, like I want to know exactly what it is you're talking about, because I can respond to that here with solutions for clients. But we know how to recycle fluorescent tubes. We know how to recycle HID, HPS, metal halide, low pressure sodium, all these types of things. I know how to recycle existing fluorescent light fixtures and HID light fixtures. Yes, they all become raw materials again. They get melted down back into metals. Okay, but the way they were built, 99% of those fixtures are 100% recyclable back into the metals that they were.
Yeah.
This is not the case for LED lighting. LED lighting is basically e-waste. And, we don't really have good streams in North America, at least, for these types of waste. The second thing with the LEDs is that they're all, like all of the innovation a lot of the innovation is wasted on mechanical form factors that are differing between various manufacturers. So if I receive back 10 skids of old LED lights, we have no idea what we're going to receive, how much metal is in it, how much plastic, what's coming out of that and all sort of stuff. With fluorescent fixtures, it didn't matter who manufactured it, when it was manufactured, or anything else. If somebody says they're going to send us 165 2x4 fluorescent choppers to recycle, I know exactly what I'm going to get and exactly what I'm going to get into. And so I think this industry in the move to LED has missed the opportunity to standardized mechanical form factors, which is a waste of innovation. If everybody's making a different size screw, socket, piece, all this kind of stuff, it's a waste of time. And if you look at this is a bit of a rant, but I'm gonna culminate with this.
Go for it.
if you look at the innovation in LED lighting, okay, where the most amazing innovations have happened, it's within the existing lamp form factors. And people say, well, that's boring, Colligan. But you know what? We went from a 26 watt, 4-foot LED T8, and now we're at 10 watts. And that's in 6 or 7 years. And people, why is that? Because all the innovation is being spent not creating a different form factor, not making a different shape. It's being spent on the LED efficiency, the quality, the reliability, the controllability, the tuning, the dimming. It's all being put into the mechanical form factor that is set. The socket, the fixture, the bulb needs to be this long. It needs to have this socket. It needs to work on this voltage and go in this type of fixture. All of that is taken off the table for the designers, and all they have to do is work in that space and improve that. And that then becomes a replaceable, field repairable component that any manufacturer can sell into. And so I feel like the industry has, I know Jacques has done a lot of work on this, but I feel like if we're going to continue to make purpose-built LED light fixtures, we have to, as an industry worldwide, standardize the mechanical form factors in some way that other people can sell into that specific unit. So waste people know what they're getting back and how it gets dismantled. And if we don't set those mechanical form factors, you're basically making piles and piles of e-waste, Mark. And I know that was a long rant, but that's what's coming, and that's not environmentally friendly. That goes against the principles of sustainability.
Whew. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's crazy in a sense that we haven't learned from history about, the early days of sort of many of the, whether it's cars or washing machines or any, this applies to so many areas of technology, where a deliberate redundancy was built in, and also, sort of uniqueness of parts and tools and everything has been seen as a sort of providing a competitive advantage between different manufacturers in order to earn more profit, rather than taking the long view in terms of the the utility of things and the repairability of things and the standardization of things to make it, eventually, I think, I can't remember how long it took in the US or in Canada to get standardization of things like nuts and bolts and their sizes.
Sure. Yes.
But I think that took about 20, 30 years or longer, on something as simple as just mechanical fixings. And so it doesn't come as a surprise that we found ourselves in this sort of situation with LEDs. But you're right, it's disappointing that we didn't learn from history and see this coming from a long way off. We've been talking about this as design. We have very unhappy clients where we know we're specifying something. We have to sort of put caveats in in specifications saying, well, of course, if you come back to replace this unit in 5 years' time because there's a failure, we cannot absolutely guarantee you're not going to have a problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and that is a failure. That is a failure in the lighting industry.
It was almost built into it, because if you look at the lighting industry, say when I started in the late 90s, you're talking about an industry that had huge capital investments in making these replacement components and selling them into existing infrastructure that was out there in the field, right? Whether that be MR16s or light bulbs or screw in this. So the capital infrastructure was dedicated to the replacement parts, right?
Yeah.
That's everything was built. All these fixture manufacturers, here's your ballasts, here's your sockets, go make these light fixtures. And then the big players, GE, Philips, and Sylvania, they were dedicated to making the replacement parts, not the actual light fixtures. That's a major major sort of mindset change. Now all the major players have abandoned replacement parts. They're not interested in selling into the critical infrastructure that exists. They're interested in replacing the critical infrastructure that exists. And they're also invested in making sure that that needs to be replaced over and over and over again on a lower and a faster life cycle. So instead of a 40-year light fixture, you want a 5-year light fixture or a 10-year light fixture. But I think we're going to betray our consumers with this. We're going to betray the end users that don't want to replace their light fixtures every 5 years. I don't think it's healthy for us.
You're preaching to the converted, I promise. Okay.
I want to ask you something about light pollution, because I wrote this down and we kind of got off on a tangent. I'm really enjoying talking to you, Mark. There's a lot of places I think we can go and kind of unpack things. But from the light pollution piece, when you were talking about local authorities and inspectors and what do we call them? Bylaw officers in Ontario, they're called. This is who it wouldn't be the police you call if somebody has a light trespass issue, right? You're going to call the bylaw. Yeah. You're going to call the bylaw officer. He's going to, how he wants to come by with a light meter or something, like, how do I write this ticket or whatever for this person? But I think I had this idea that, we really don't care that much about light trespass here and there. So what if, in terms of the movement of darkness restoration or dark skies, like light trespass is a neighborly issue or a city issue in a particular area and into a community and something like that. But I think we could figure out the light trespass. I don't know how we figure out the sky glow issue. Like, how do we measure sky glow? Do we have any metrics for that? Like, you start to explore this dark sky movement, and you find out that actually, I'm not even sure we know how to measure light pollution correctly. Now, astronomers say they can do it. Some of the lighting guys, more the light pollution guys, are saying there is no metric. I'm getting different answers from people. But do we have ways, have you encountered any ways of measuring the impact of a lighting system on darkness? Is there any of these numbers areas, or is it going to remain an art that a good lighting, a dark sky system when you see it? I know one when I see it, but is it like an art, that it's never going to be able to get out of that?
Yeah, I'm not aware, and we haven't got involved in strict measurement of light pollution criteria. I mean, obviously on individual buildings, you can within reason measure light trespass and light spill from the building, through computer modeling. I mean, that's been around for a long time. But when we talk about sky glow, theoretically, you could sort of, take a building or take a roadway lighting scheme, and I guess you can model it and actually sort of put a measuring plane in to sort of see how much light is traveling upwards. But then, what are you comparing that to? What's someone asking? So no one's putting strict measurements on it. So therefore, what it's down to is that coming back to, as you say, best practice and sort of, knowing the difference between a good way of doing things and a bad way of doing things. And I think in the short to medium term, that's going to be the way forwards. It's sort of understanding that, and I think it's tricky. One of the conundrums we often face as lighting designers is the lighting of vertical surfaces at night. I mentioned earlier that one way of making a more legible environment is to illuminate vertical surfaces so that you understand the space that you're in, rather than it's just all light on the horizontal. But quite often you find that many of those vertical features at night in open landscape or in urban situations quite often don't have a ceiling or a means by which to downlight them. You end up putting, like as a wall with a bunch of uplighters, sort of focused on the wall, but nonetheless, it's still upward, it's still bouncing, the reflected component is going up into the sky. And whilst architectural lighting per se is not probably, guilty of being the sort of the worst contributor to light pollution, I guess it all adds up. We know that highway lighting and sports stadium lighting and uncontrolled signage lighting, there's a lot of other big offenders. If you drew a pie chart of what causes light pollution, architectural lighting would be a very small slither on that pie chart compared to many other forms of more industrialized lighting. But nonetheless, yeah, you're absolutely right. There isn't a sort of great way of measuring and determining and dictating this, other than sort of asking people to sort of follow best practice. I mean, you see that in Dark Skies Ordinance, in a sense. It's a series of sort of guidelines to follow in order to sort of, if everybody did that, we'd have dark skies.
Exactly.
Kind
yes.
of.
Yes.
But there's no way.
We're not sure what would happen, but things would be a lot better.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, precisely. It comes from that sort of model. So I don't see an immediate change to that. But I think part of the story for us it's to do with education, and it's to do with a change in attitude, and it's to do with trying to um, talk to people, particularly the public, the wider public, and politicians and people that decision makers and people that sort of control the environment, and try and persuade them that darkness is not always a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember years ago when we were working in the city of Durham, we were commissioned and we won the tender to produce a lighting strategy for Durham. It's a historic city in the north of England, as I'm sure you're aware, originally a sort of mining city, but there's a beautiful cathedral and a beautiful castle. It's very picturesque, and actually, surprisingly dark. It's a sort of quite a low little. When we were there, it was certainly had fairly low lighting levels, and even sort of a whole network of medieval alleys called venels that were totally unlit, which was pretty surprising to find in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
We decided to call our strategy a light and darkness strategy right from the outset, and to begin with, that was seen as a little bit controversial by the commissioning client, to the local city council, saying, well, hang on a second, we want a lighting strategy, and said, no. Part of the value of your city, look how beautiful it is at night, that it's not sort of, you don't have lots of issues with light pollution, you're not overlit yet.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
actually, so your strategy should be to sort of preserve and conserve what you have as much as to improve and to add to it. So if you want to, we're the wrong people. If you want a lighting strategy to light this all up and sort of get rid of the current character, what you want to do is to sort of get the balance right between improving the areas that need improving, but restoring and retaining the areas of darkness that you already have, and that was seen as a pretty groundbreaking strategy when we first released that. I'm trying to remember precisely when it was. I can get you the data for if you need it, but it was certainly a few years ago, 2007. I'm taking a guess, but I may be wrong.
Ooh, that's actually quite a while ago for
Yeah,
that. Wow. I was going to
I can.
say, yeah, that's actually, it's interesting because the trade association that presents this show is considering becoming funding research, and we're looking at one project right now that's more to do with color rendering. But another, we're looking at some of these darkness issues out there. And one of the things that they want to name the foundation is the Lighting and Darkness Research Foundation. And so that it's both together, lighting and
Yeah,
darkness
absolutely.
research, and so that the darkness component of it is at the forefront. We've almost coming up on an hour here. I can't believe it, Mark. It's been
Wow,
such a
really?
great,
Wow.
yeah, isn't it wild?
Yeah. Okay. It's really flown. It's flown by. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I think drives the Restoring Darkness podcast from my perspective is actually I have no idea how to solve this problem. I'm very interested in it. And so when I have the honor of speaking to people like you and many of our other great guests on Restoring Darkness who, have a lot of knowledge, they're professors, PhDs, designers of major architecture in the world, and I talk to them, I think that the industry needs to express some humility, like as a whole, and maybe and come out and say, we need to change some things because we're not doing things the right way right now. Instead of this posturing of like, we're going to twist a little bit towards darkness restoration, we're going to twist a little bit, but we did everything right. Everything was okay in the past, but we're going to slowly, turn towards this over the next 25 years. I think if we just came out and said, hey, I think we've made some mistakes with our LED lighting upgrades, and it wasn't all improvement over HPS. We've lost something with the low Kelvin temperature of HPS, and we want to return to that. And so we've made some mistakes, and we want to fix those mistakes. And I think that kind of dialogue invites regulators. It invites people to the table to sit down and to do things. And the posturing and the inability to say that nothing went wrong in the past and we didn't do anything that was an error, and heads in the sand. I think that's causing problems. And I think if we just said, guys, it's not anybody's exact fault personally, okay? But as an industry, we can fix this problem. Everybody's going to make a lot of money, and we're going to make lots of light fixtures, and there's going to be lots of light fixtures to sell and work to do for everybody. In fact, there's going to be new careers for lighting controls integrators and people that are going to have wonderful jobs, installing and
Yeah,
commissioning
absolutely.
this stuff. I wish we could get a sense of hope around this movement and joy rather than sort of, okay, darkness restoration. I see it. Okay, I'm going to quickly talk about it and move back. There's like a kind of we're afraid to dive into the deep end here, but I think that's our future,
Yeah.
Mark.
I agree with that sentiment entirely. You've expressed it so well. And I have to say, if there's any one incentive for people to get together and do it that way, is there will be a point, maybe in the future. I'm not encouraging this, but I'm just saying there may be a point that, as with other industries, there will come a point when polluter pays. And if the
You got
lighting industry gets into that territory of polluter pays, it's going to be a whole different world. I think at some point I wrote an article where we were sort of talking about light in the future in 2050 and how it might be in cities, and sort of, with the advent of changes in, leaning towards pedestrianization, less cars. So maybe, street lighting needing to change in response more to pedestrian movement than car movement, the whole upending of the way in which we light cities and why we light them. And I wrote a sort of theoretical piece about this sort of, kind of city of the future and how it might play out.
mm,
And one of the things I introduced was the idea of on taxation on issues of light spill and light pollution. And then
mm.
somebody who read that said, "I can't believe you let that genie out of the bottle." I said, "Come on, it's really obvious that at some point someone's going to find a way, at governmental level, to sort of monetize this if we all don't sort of get our act together and work away." Now, at the moment, as you say, measuring that or deciding who's the polluter and how they're the
Hmm.
polluter is not, fortunately, going to go down that line. But they, with regulatory frameworks, if they do come in very quickly, in my experience, money follows.
Yeah. Well, you're seeing that in Europe with the mercury light ban, right? You're seeing that right
Yeah.
now. It's interesting. I do another podcast called Get a Grip on Lighting, and we were having a conversation on that show, and the guest was talking about regulation, and I said, well, I expressed some disappointment, like why is innovation following regulation? And he said, what are you talking about? He goes, we've already invented all this technology. Someone just needs to tell us what to do with it in a way. And I think in that, you need we have the technology, and now the governments are saying, well, use it to do this. And
Yeah.
I think that's important. It's an important piece, and it's a nuanced discussion. It's not right versus left. It's just like
No,
this
no.
is important. Sometimes you need a carrot, sometimes you need a stick, sometimes you need to knock heads together. And I think regulation sometimes forces the right regulations, with enforcement, which is another issue. Regulation without enforcement is punishing of the compliant, you know?
Yeah.
So you have to be able to enforce these regulations. And if we get too complicated, but this idea of, it's interesting that you mentioned that's a really creative idea to tax light output rather than and energy use. And I actually I'm not a big fan of taxes. I'll be honest with you. I don't like income taxes.
None of us are.
I don't like income taxes. I don't like property taxes. I love consumption taxes. I think consumption taxes of different things are very progressive. If you want to buy a Ferrari, you got to pay 13% on the cost of the car, buddy. That's how it works. And we could probably but this idea of creating, finding a way to monetize the use of light in a way that forces people to think about how much it costs. Imagine if electricity was free, how much people would use of it. Now, obviously, we want to make it accessible. We want to make it affordable. But if you don't charge for something, like you said earlier, it has no value by definition, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So, in a sense, requiring people to sort of, value it or at the end of the day, you know, if it hurts in the pocket, then people will start to think of more creative and innovative ways in which to sort of deliver what is needed, but in what ultimately will become a more sustainable manner. So I think there are a lot of, we've seen already here in the UK, with the cost of, the massive spiraling cost of electricity, a lot more discussion about lighting in the last few months than I've heard in
Mm-hmm.
years on public radio broadcast, about sort of people turning their lights off, and, and I keep, I listened to the radio the other day, and there was some, poor old lady saying, but, I'm really afraid of turning my lights off, and I just wanted the broadcaster to say, you don't need to turn them off, you just need a means to turn them down.
Mm.
It's not
Mm-hmm.
it's not as sort of black and white as saying, on or off. But of course,
Mm.
she doesn't have I'm sure she doesn't have a dimmer on her lights, and so because she could save electricity by turning her lights down
Sure.
throughout her house, but she was making the binary choice between, I can either have my lights on and pay a lot in electricity, or I can have my lights. And people here are getting pretty at the at the sort of the poorer end of the social and income scale.
Mm-hmm.
But really, making
Suffering.
choices about reducing the number of times they boil the kettle a day, because
Yeah.
they're really down right at the kind of the edge of survival in terms of being able to pay these electricity bills that have spiraled massively out of control. I mean, it's
Yeah.
crazy at the moment. It's the same in Canada. So,
Canada is a very wealthy nation. By comparison, I mean, Canada's bigger than all of Europe. You can fit, France and Germany into Ontario. You can fit France, Germany, and Spain into Quebec. You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah,
we're talking massive resources. Ontario, where I live, and Quebec are probably the two cleanest electricity jurisdictions in the world. I mean, I don't know that for
wow,
sure, but Ontario is about 60% nuclear and 30% hydro, something like that.
hmm
So it's dams and nuclear reactors, and then Quebec is basically all hydroelectricity. So
yeah,
we have a lot of energy in Ontario. I think we're not screaming it from the rooftops. I mean, but we probably should, because we basically our electricity grids in Ontario, Quebec are way ahead of everyone else's anyway. 80% carbon free, or whatever, however that metric is. But you know what? I want the politicians to stop, and the broadcasters stop picking on the lighting industry. We've done a lot, actually. I'm going to raise my hand. I don't know how it is in the UK, okay, but in Ontario, we've changed a lot of lights, and we've done it twice, okay? We went from T12 to T8, and then we went
yeah.
from T8 to LED, or T5 to LED, and we went from incandescent to CFL, and then went from CFL to LED. And you know what? Our industry has provided all the energy savings in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Okay? It's time for the HVAC guys to step up. It's time for some, you know what I mean? Pick on those guys.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It seems like everybody turns to, we need to save energy. Where are the lighting guys? It's like, can we have a little bit of room here to look at other areas of light other than just energy efficiency?
Yeah, I was giving a talk yesterday, and I said, obviously, a lot of people talk about sort of the problems of light and light pollution, but if we could see all the cooling and the heating escaping from buildings, if we
Hmm.
could see that,
Mm-hmm.
there'd be a lot bigger conversation about that whole issue. But it's but light as a very visible form of energy use
Mm-hmm.
is obviously right there out in the open for people to witness. So I don't disagree with you. Don't disagree with you at all about the HVAC guys.
Well, I'll tell you this: get yourself. I bet you there's an infrared app. I mean, 20 years ago, you'd have to buy a $7,000 camera, but today there's probably an infrared app on your iPhone. You could probably point it at a building and watch the
Yeah,
cooling escaping in the summer and the heat escaping
absolutely.
from different windows that aren't sealed properly, or what have you. It's so yeah, pick on those
We
guys a
should
little bit.
encourage that. Yeah, we should encourage that.
Go pick on the HVAC guys for a while. Hey, Mark, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you, and I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Right. No, I've enjoyed it too, and time has really flown. And so, thank you very much for asking me to be part of your podcast, and it's been a very very enjoyable time. Thank you.
Yeah, our pleasure. Hey, is there any final thoughts you have for the Restoring Darkness listeners, just to put a nightcap on it?
Well, you mentioned the Roland acronym earlier. This sort of move towards responsible outdoor lighting at night, and I really liked that term when I first heard it,
Mm-hmm.
because
Me too.
I think sustainability is a sort of difficult word. It's become quite devalued
Mm-hmm.
over the last sort of 30 years since it's been in 30 plus years since it's been in use. And I think applying the more sort of current terms of sort of what regenerative design means to the lighting industry is
Mm.
kind of tricky. We're still getting our heads around some of those words and some of the sort of tenets around sort of making sort of positive contributions, if you see what I mean, rather than always talking about how we can you know do things in a sort of in better ways that we can we sort of we're beginning to talk about sort of making more sort of positive contributions to everything from local. And to me, making a positive contribution is sometimes about taking things away, like light, restoring darkness is a sort of, you could say would be deemed to be a negative act, but we need to see it as a positive act. But I think that this word responsibility is the best word to use. So my parting shot would be to say, if we can all just sort of take this more responsible approach, more balanced approach to lighting design, I think that's the first stepping stone towards a much better future. And so that's certainly what we're doing in our practice.
And just to finish off here, folks, I'm going to change to life rather than just lighting, because I think we could all do a better job being more responsible. And I think maybe that would be an interesting word for the 21st century. And I thank Mark for coming on the show, Mark Major. All of his social media, he's got Instagram, a LinkedIn, and a Twitter account. It's going to be posted on the restoringdarkness.com website. And thank you, listeners, for making it to the end with us. Bye for now.
Look no further for dark sky-friendly products than Evluma. Since its first product launch, Evluma has carried one or more International Dark Sky Association certified models. If your customer cares about light pollution, suggest the OmniMax with shielding or the AreaMax with full cutoff to reduce uplight and glare. Evluma, illuminating the pursuit of darkness.